This is my true story. I spent my whole life working, saving, and trusting that my son would carry my name with pride. But one day, I learned he had stolen from me, my own blood, my own child. He took my credit card while I was asleep and spent money like it was his right. The betrayal cut deeper than any wound. But instead of shouting, I stayed calm. I watched, I planned, and I used the same silence he mistook for weakness to build my revenge. What happened next shocked even him. Before I tell you, subscribe. This story deserves to be heard. He had spent most of his life under the sun, the kind of sun that burns your skin but feeds your dreams. Every drop of sweat that rolled down his back carried a story of hope. He worked long hours at a factory, lifting heavy metal and breathing smoke that stained his lungs. But when he came home at night, he would smile as if the day hadn't hurt him. His body was tired, but his heart was full. Because for him, hard work was not a burden. It was love in motion. He had grown up with nothing, no shoes that fit, no bed that was his alone. So when his first paycheck came, he made a promise to himself. His son would never live that way. Every coin he earned was divided into two parts, one for today's survival and one for tomorrow's security. He learned to skip meals, to repair old clothes, to live quietly while saving loudly. There was no luxury, but there was peace in knowing that his son would always have something to hold on to when he was gone. He used to work double shifts, sleeping on benches during breaks. The factory air was thick and hard to breathe, but he never complained. He told himself that every cough, every ache, every cut was a small price for his son's comfort. When others spent their pay on drinks or parties, he bought books and school supplies. When others bought new shirts, he paid for extra classes. When others rested, he kept building a future that wasn't even for him. That was his quiet pride, to suffer so his child could smile. On Sundays, when most men sat with their families, he repaired things around the house. He fixed broken chairs, repainted old walls, polished shoes until they shined. The neighbors laughed at his simplicity, but he didn't mind. He wasn't working for applause. He was working for love. Every nail he hammered into the walls of that small house carried a piece of his heart. He often said that the best inheritance a father can give is not money. It's a home built with clean hands and honest sweat. He taught his son about effort, how to earn before spending, how to speak softly but stand firmly, how to treat others with respect. In the evenings, he'd sit with the boy and tell stories about fairness, loyalty, and integrity. The son listened, nodding, promising he would never forget. The father believed him. Back then, he still thought promises meant something. Back then, his son's eyes were full of gratitude. Years passed, and the old man's body began to show the price of his labor. His knees cracked when he walked, his back bent, and his hands shook when he lifted a cup. But he still smiled when his son succeeded. He felt proud every time the boy bought something new, every time he spoke of promotions or success. He thought to himself, it was all worth it. Every blister, every sleepless night, every pain. It all made sense because his son was living the dream he once had to bury under work. He was never jealous, never bitter. When his son bought his first car, the father didn't think of what he didn't have. He only thought of how far they had come. He remembered walking miles in the rain, carrying lunch in a tin box because he couldn't afford the bus. Now his son had leather seats and cold air blowing on his face. To the old man, that was victory. That was success in its purest form. To see your bloodline live better than you did. He had trusted his son with everything, his heart, his name, his savings, even his future. When his son asked for control of certain accounts, saying it would be easier for management, the father didn't hesitate. He believed honesty was something inherited, like a family trait. He signed papers without reading too much, not out of carelessness, but faith. He never imagined the same hands he once held would someday betray him through ink and numbers. The father didn't live for money. He lived for meaning. Every dollar in his account represented hours of his life that he could never get back. Time traded for survival, energy traded for love. When his son used that money, he wanted him to use it with purpose. He didn't mind sharing. He just wanted respect to come with it. He didn't need thanks, just kindness. just care. But life doesn't always repay goodness with goodness. Sometimes it tests how deep your strength goes when the people you raised forget who you are. As he grew older, his world became smaller, mornings with tea, evenings by the window. But his love remained large. Even when he felt weak, he still gave. Even when his own hand shook, he still wrote checks for his son's projects. He was proud to see his name in documents, not realizing how easily that trust could be twisted. To him, love meant never doubting. He thought loyalty flowed downward and upward in a family like blood. But trust, he learned, is like glass. Once cracked, it never looks the same again. He often thought about the value of money, not in numbers, but in moments. Every dollar he earned had a memory. The first paycheck he ever received, the night he paid the hospital bill for his wife, the time he bought his son his first bicycle. Money was never just currency. It was a diary of sacrifices written in invisible ink. And so, when betrayal came through stolen funds, it wasn't the amount that hurt him. It was what it represented. Years of sweat reduced to digits on a stolen card. He used to wake early, long before dawn, because old habits never die. The world outside was quiet, but inside his head, memories played like an endless film. He could still hear the factory bell, the laughter of co-workers, the soft voice of his wife before she passed. He had built a life from the ground up, brick by brick, with nothing but his willpower. And yet, the very person for whom he built it all looked at his effort and saw only numbers to exploit. He wondered when greed replaced gratitude, when comfort replaced compassion. Maybe it was gradual, a few lies, a few excuses, until love turned into entitlement. He didn't understand modern ways, online accounts, passwords, digital wallets, but he understood betrayal in any language. Betrayal always sounds the same, silence where there used to be love. He didn't rage, he didn't curse, he didn't even cry. He just sat in his chair, staring at the same hands that had built everything. He thought about all the things those hands had done, held his son, built a home, earned every cent. Now they were old, wrinkled, shaking, but still clean. That was his pride. He had never stolen from anyone, never taken what wasn't his. And he promised himself he would end his life the same way he began it, with honesty, dignity, and self-respect intact. He knew revenge wasn't about destruction. It was about correction. It was about teaching the truth to someone who had forgotten it. He didn't want to ruin his son. He wanted to make him understand what real value was. Because love, when betrayed, doesn't disappear. It transforms into clarity. The father saw everything clearly now. The lines on his face, the cracks in his heart, the truth in his silence. So, he waited. Not with anger, but with purpose. The same patience that built a lifetime would now build his answer. He didn't need to shout to make himself heard. He didn't need to punish with fists or words. He just needed to let the system, the law, and time do what they always do, expose what's real. And through it all, one thought stayed in his mind. He had given everything, not for money, but for love. And love, when taken for granted, always finds a way to balance itself. The same patience that raised a son would now teach him a lesson that could not be unlearned. When dawn came the next morning, the father sat quietly at his window. The sun rose over the same street he had walked for 40 years. He smiled faintly, not out of joy, but peace. He knew the world had changed, not him. He had built a legacy through pain, and now he would protect it through wisdom. Because sometimes the strongest revenge is not rage, it's restraint. And the truest victory is not wealth, it's dignity. It started small, numbers that didn't add up, receipts that didn't belong. The father noticed charges on his credit card for things he had never seen, places he had never been. At first, he thought it was a bank mistake, something technical, nothing serious. But the list kept growing. Transactions appeared one after another, like small cuts in his trust. Gas stations across town, expensive dinners, electronics he could never use. Each charge was a quiet betrayal printed in black ink. He had always been careful with money. Every penny he earned had a name and a purpose. Bills, groceries, savings, and charity. Nothing was ever wasted. So when he saw large withdrawals and card payments piling up, something inside him broke. He tried to recall if he had lent the card to anyone, but his memory was sharp. He knew where it was supposed to be, inside the small wooden box by his bed. That box had held his trust for years. Now, even that was empty. He didn't rush to accuse anyone. He was a man of patience, shaped by years of endurance. But when he saw his son walking around with new things, a watch, new shoes, a sleek phone, he started connecting dots. The timing matched, the transactions matched, and the pattern was too perfect to be coincidence. Still, he waited, hoping for honesty to come before confrontation. But honesty never came. What came instead was silence and avoidance. He asked small questions. "Did you use my card for anything?" But was met with excuses. The son brushed it off as a mix-up, saying he must have accidentally taken the wrong one, promising to fix it soon. The father wanted to believe him. For a moment, he even convinced himself that love couldn't be that blind. But love, he realized, can be blind when it wants peace more than truth. He put the card away, only to find new charges appear days later. It became clear, this wasn't an accident. It was theft dressed in convenience. His son had stolen from him and lied about it with the same mouth that once called him father. The man didn't feel rage, he felt emptiness. Because betrayal from strangers wounds the skin, but betrayal from your own blood poisons the soul. He sat quietly that night, holding the card in his hand, feeling the weight of plastic and heartbreak together. He remembered all the years he had saved, the nights he skipped meals, the mornings he worked with pain in his back. All those sacrifices were now numbers on someone else's receipt. He thought of how easily his trust was taken, how carelessly it was spent. Each swipe of that card wasn't just money being stolen, it was respect, decency, and the bond between a father and son. He didn't tell anyone. Pride wouldn't let him. He had built his reputation on being strong and dependable, not the kind of man whose own child could take advantage of him. But the silence hurt more than any gossip could. He started keeping records, dates, times, receipts, not for revenge, but for truth. He wanted to see the story on paper, not just feel it in his chest. And as the pages filled, the truth became undeniable. His own son had robbed him not once, not twice, but over and over again. He walked to the bank one morning, pretending it was a regular visit. He asked for a printout of his statements. The teller, a young woman with kind eyes, handed them over with a polite smile. But when he looked down, the numbers blurred. Thousands gone. Dozens of transactions he couldn't explain. His hands trembled, but he held them steady. The paper didn't lie. It told him everything his son wouldn't. The next stop was quiet, a small cafe near the park. He ordered tea, sat by the window, and began to read. Line by line, transaction by transaction, he built the timeline of his betrayal. Each entry was a memory rewritten. Where he once thought of his son's laughter, he now saw lies. Where he once saw family, he now saw deceit. The tea grew cold, untouched. His heart wasn't broken in one blow. It was being chipped away, little by little, with every purchase his son made. He remembered how he used to teach his boy about value, not just of money, but of effort. He taught him that a single dollar earned with honesty was worth more than 10 stolen in shame. But somewhere along the way, the lessons had faded. The boy had learned comfort without cost, success without sacrifice. The father had given him everything, and in doing so, had taught him to take without gratitude. He thought back to his wife, now gone, and wondered what she would say if she knew. She had always been gentle with their son, always defending him. Maybe she would have said it was a mistake. Maybe she would have begged him to forgive. But forgiveness without accountability is just permission to repeat the same pain. The father decided he would not repeat his mistake, not this time. That night, he checked his wallet again. The card was still there, worn but not broken. He ran his fingers over the raised numbers, the name embossed in fading silver. That name still meant something. It was his identity, his years of struggle, his worth, all tied to that small rectangle. He realized something then. It wasn't the card that mattered. It was the ownership behind it. The right to decide what happens to what you've earned. And that right he would reclaim fully. The more he thought, the clearer his mind became. There was no need for shouting, no need for scenes. He wouldn't confront his son in anger because anger fades, but action lasts. He decided that the best revenge wasn't destruction, it was correction. He would use the same tools his son used, the system, the bank, the numbers, but this time with purpose. He went back to the bank the next morning, early, before the rush. He spoke to the manager, not as a broken man, but as a client with questions. He explained the fraudulent charges, the recurring transactions, and the unauthorized access. The staff listened carefully, offering forms, advice, and the promise of an investigation. The father nodded, signing everything with steady hands. Each signature was a quiet reclaiming of power. He didn't feel old that day. He felt aware that trust needs protection and love doesn't excuse theft. He began the process of freezing certain accounts, transferring funds to safer ones, and securing his records. He didn't tell his son any of it. He wanted him to learn the way all careless men learn, through shock. When he returned home that night, his son was laughing on the phone, talking about new plans, new purchases. The father walked past quietly, his steps slow but certain. He no longer needed explanations. The truth was heavy enough. He knew what was coming, and he was ready for it. Days later, the investigation confirmed what he already knew. Unauthorized use, repeated access, and linked accounts pointing back to his son. The bank had the proof. He had the peace. Now, it was no longer a father's suspicion, it was fact. And once the truth becomes fact, the world starts listening. He sat in his chair that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon. He thought of everything he had lost, not just money, but belief. But he also thought of everything he still had: wisdom, patience, control. The same traits that once built his life would now rebuild it again, without his son's help. In the end, betrayal didn't make him bitter. It made him sharper. It reminded him that love without boundaries becomes a weapon against yourself. His son had used his kindness like a key, but he had forgotten one thing. Even doors can be locked again. And when the time came, the father would make sure that lock stayed closed, not with anger, but with quiet, calculated peace. Because the only thing stronger than pain is purpose. And now his purpose was clear. The truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. The father had the proof, the evidence printed in his hands, and yet, what hurt more was the realization behind it. His son's actions were not a moment of desperation or mistake. They were deliberate, planned, continuous. Each transaction, each lie, each excuse was part of a pattern that had been growing slowly, like rust under paint. The father had trusted so blindly, he hadn't noticed how long the corrosion had been spreading beneath his own roof. The more he looked back, the more things started making sense. The sudden trips, the expensive things that appeared without explanation, the whispers over phone calls that stopped when he entered the room, they had all been signs. He had ignored them because he didn't want to believe. Because sometimes the heart sees the truth but refuses to accept it. He remembered his own father's words, long forgotten. Love is not blind, it just doesn't want to open its eyes. Now, those words echoed in the silence of his house. He began to see how deep the betrayal had gone. It wasn't just about the card. His son had also taken small amounts of money from joint accounts, shifted funds between names, and made unauthorized purchases in the family business, all hidden under charm and manipulation. The father had been used, not loved, turned into a resource, not a person. The man who had once built everything from sweat was now being drained by the very blood he had raised. He remembered when his wife was alive, how she used to say their son had expensive taste. Back then, it sounded harmless, like a compliment. But now, he realized it was a warning disguised as pride. Expensive taste without discipline becomes greed, and greed, once fed, doesn't stop until it eats everything, even the hand that feeds it. He started piecing together the timeline. For months, the theft had been happening quietly, beneath his nose. His son had been smart, never taking too much at once, just enough to stay unnoticed. That was the cruelty of it. This wasn't a crime of need. It was a crime of convenience. The father wasn't robbed by poverty. He was robbed by entitlement. He began to feel a strange mix of emotions: sadness, disappointment, and something darker: acceptance. Not acceptance of defeat, but of reality. He finally saw his son not as a boy, but as a man shaped by his own unchecked generosity. He had given too much, forgiven too quickly, trusted too easily. Love without limits, he realized, can become a weapon when placed in the wrong hands. He spent nights awake, replaying moments in his head: the smiles, the laughter, the shared meals. Every memory now carried a shadow. He wondered how long his son had been pretending, how many times he had looked him in the eye while secretly stealing behind his back. The thought burned deeper than any wound. It wasn't the loss of money that broke him. It was the loss of meaning. One morning, as he looked at his reflection in the mirror, he barely recognized the man staring back. His eyes were tired, but sharp. The years had carved lines of both love and regret across his face. But somewhere behind those wrinkles, a spark returned, a quiet determination. He told himself that he wouldn't let his life's work end as someone else's mistake. He would not die a fool who trusted blindly. He would end this chapter with clarity and dignity. He began reviewing his estate records one by one. Each document, each contract, each statement. He discovered more inconsistencies, subtle manipulations, transfers he hadn't signed, permissions altered. The betrayal ran deeper than a single theft. It had grown into a web. And his son was at the center of it, pulling strings he didn't deserve to touch. Still, the father didn't break. Years of struggle had built him to withstand pain that others couldn't imagine. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He simply began to act. He consulted lawyers quietly, asking about asset protections, financial reversals, and ownership clauses. He spoke softly, with the calm of someone who had seen storms and survived them. The legal experts listened, surprised at how organized and deliberate he was. They called him wise. He called it experience. He realized something powerful. The same patience that once made him a good father could now make him a formidable strategist. He didn't want revenge. He wanted justice. He didn't want to hurt his son. He wanted to teach him the cost of disrespect. Because when love is betrayed, punishment is never about hatred. It's about truth correcting itself. He thought about confronting his son, but decided against it. Words could be twisted. Emotions could be faked. But legal action speaks in signatures, not emotions. It cannot be argued with. It doesn't shout. It simply declares. So, he prepared quietly. He gathered documents, verified ownerships, froze accounts, and began shifting control back into his own hands. Every form he signed was a nail sealing the coffin of deceit. There was something poetic in the silence of it all. No fights, no drama. Just paperwork. Cold, factual, undeniable. He found peace in process. Every stamp, every signature, every notarized page gave him back a piece of his stolen respect. The same son who once laughed at his simplicity would soon learn that simplicity doesn't mean weakness. It means strength, wrapped in calm. The betrayal had taken so much, but it had also given him back something he had lost years ago: clarity. He finally saw the truth of people and the real worth of things. Money wasn't evil. It was neutral. It only revealed the heart of whoever touched it. His son had failed that test. But the father? He had passed it with quiet grace. He remembered the last time he saw his son truly happy, years ago, when he gave him his first allowance. The boy had promised to save it, to use it wisely. That small promise had grown into a habit of taking without returning. Somewhere along the way, gratitude died and greed took its place. The father knew that this wasn't just his son's failure. It was his own, too. He had protected too much, forgiven too easily, and never taught the boundary between help and handout. But now, that lesson would be learned, not through words, but through consequence. The father didn't need to yell to make a point. He would let the bank statements, the ownership transfers, and the silence do the talking. As days passed, he withdrew emotionally. He stopped asking questions, stopped offering help. His son didn't notice at first. Arrogance blinds people to change until it's too late. The father spent his evenings reading, walking, and reflecting. The house felt lighter without conversations, but heavier with truth. He began to heal, not from the theft, but from the illusion. Because sometimes healing means accepting that what you loved no longer exists. His son wasn't the boy he raised. He was the man he created through endless forgiveness. And now, it was time to let him face the mirror. The father sat by his window one evening, watching the last light of day fade into darkness. He thought about all he had lost. Not money, not property, but something far greater. The belief that love alone was enough. He realized love needs respect to survive, and respect cannot grow in the soil of entitlement. He had watered the wrong tree, and it had borne bitter fruit. But that night, he made a promise, not of revenge, but of redemption. He would clean the mess his love had allowed. He would restore order, not through rage, but through reason. He would let the world see that even the quietest man can roar without making a sound. And when that day came, the day his son would wake to find everything gone, every privilege erased, every illusion shattered, he wouldn't need to explain. The silence of loss would do it for him. Because betrayal teaches through emptiness what words can never express. When betrayal becomes clear, pain turns into precision. The father no longer acted from emotion. He acted from understanding. He knew that shouting would only echo into empty rooms, but paperwork would echo forever. So, he began gathering what he had left, not just money, but proof. Proof of what was taken, how it was taken, and who had taken it. The truth, once silent, would now have a voice made of ink and documents. He started with the bank statements, sitting at his small wooden desk under the dim light of an old lamp. The papers were cold and factual, free of emotion, but he could see the story hidden in the numbers. Each withdrawal, each transfer, each unexplained purchase. It was all there. He highlighted them one by one, as if tracing footsteps in the snow. The trail led straight to the same name, the same address, the same careless greed. His own son. He organized everything into folders, one for transactions, one for assets, one for legal ownerships. Years of working in disciplined order had made him patient and thorough. He wasn't just a father anymore. He was an investigator, quietly building a case. But unlike detectives in stories, he didn't chase anyone. He let the truth come to him. And the truth, when you look for it calmly, always shows up. He spoke to the bank manager again, this time not as a victim, but as a man reclaiming control. He requested account access logs, ATM locations, timestamps. He wanted to see the pattern. The staff were polite, but surprised at his clarity. Many old men they met came in lost, confused, unable to remember passwords. But this one was different. He remembered everything, not numbers, but moments. The day he handed his son the card, the trust that came with it, the silence that followed. He collected printed evidence from every source, the receipts, the statements, even the email notifications that had gone unread. It was painful to look at, but pain was no longer his enemy. It was his motivation. Each document was a brick in the wall of reality he was building, and he planned to make that wall unbreakable. He met with his lawyer, a man he had trusted for years. The lawyer listened quietly as the old man laid the papers on the table, one after another. There was no trembling in his hands, no tears in his eyes, only purpose. The lawyer asked a few questions, checked signatures, verified ownerships, and then looked up with quiet respect. Everything the father had was legal, traceable, and binding. The son had used deceit, but the father would use law, the cleanest weapon of all. They began drafting new authorizations. The lawyer explained how to transfer control, how to reclaim titles, how to freeze access in ways that could not be undone without proper consent. The father listened carefully, nodding slowly, absorbing every word. He wasn't just protecting his wealth, he was protecting his dignity. He had already lost trust once. He wouldn't lose it again. For days, he worked like a man half his age. He reviewed old agreements, located forgotten documents, and re-signed forms that gave him full ownership of his estate. He found accounts that had his son listed as secondary signatory, and one by one, he removed him. The lawyer smiled and said, "You're very thorough." The father replied softly, "When you build something all your life, you learn to fix it with care." He went through insurance policies, property titles, investment portfolios, and business shares, all the things his son thought were his by inheritance. The father made sure that every item, every asset, every future claim was rewritten. But he didn't transfer them to strangers or hide them. He placed them under a private trust, one designed to hold everything safely until the day he chose otherwise. It wasn't just revenge, it was structure. It was order returning to a world that had been disordered by greed. He visited his accountant too. Together, they reviewed old tax documents and account ledgers. The accountant looked surprised when the old man asked for detailed transaction histories going back years. But the father explained, "I need to know every path my money walked." And so he did. He traced every dollar that had left his account, every loan that had been signed in his name, every check that had been endorsed without his permission. What he discovered shocked him, not in amount, but in audacity. His son had not only stolen, he had used his father's reputation to open new doors. There were business deals signed using his name, small property exchanges done quietly, and purchases labeled as family use. It was more than financial theft. It was identity theft, not in the modern sense of data, but in the old sense of character. His son had borrowed not just his money, but his honor. And that, he decided, could not stand. The father kept every piece of proof in a locked briefcase. Each document was dated, labeled, and categorized. It wasn't revenge material. It was justice material. Because in the end, truth doesn't need anger to win. It just needs evidence and time. And he had both. Late at night, he would sit by his table, organizing the folders. The ticking clock was the only sound. He didn't feel bitterness anymore. What he felt was power. Quiet, measured power. The kind of power that comes from knowing you no longer have to explain yourself. The kind of power that doesn't shout because truth already whispers loud enough. He also began gathering information from public records. Property deeds, business filings, asset transfers, everything his son had touched. It was tiring, but necessary. He discovered that several assets his son believed were his were still registered under the father's name. All it took was one signature to reclaim them completely, and that he would do. He prepared letters of notice to relevant institutions, updating ownership and contact information. He added clauses that required his direct consent for any future changes. He ensured that even if something happened to him, his lawyer would handle everything as instructed. The structure he built was not emotional. It was mechanical, foolproof, and permanent. Every action he took had meaning. Every signature was deliberate. Every document sealed another chapter of betrayal and opened a new one of justice. He wasn't rushing. He was rebuilding. He knew that if he acted from rage, he'd make mistakes. But if he acted from calm, he'd make history. A quiet history of a father who turned pain into order. He contacted financial institutions discreetly to inform them of unauthorized use and to request that all notifications and authorizations go directly to him. He verified every card, every account, every beneficiary. What once was shared now became single. His son's access shrank slowly until there was nothing left for him to touch. It was poetic. The same speed at which the son had taken, the father was now reclaiming, calmly and completely. He reviewed communication records, emails, messages, and statements. It became clear that some of his son's associates knew about the misuse, but chose silence. Betrayal, he learned, rarely travels alone. But he didn't chase them or expose them. He wasn't here to fight everyone. His focus was singular, to restore his name and take back what belonged to him. The lawyer called him unusually composed. Most men, after such a betrayal, would act impulsively, file charges, seek confrontation, demand apologies. But this old man was different. He wanted none of that. He didn't need noise. He wanted silence, the kind of silence that frightens the guilty because it means something irreversible is coming. When all the folders were done, he labeled them neatly and placed them in a drawer. On each, he wrote the same word in clean handwriting: truth. That was his final weapon. Not anger, not shouting, just the undeniable weight of reality, written in ink and sealed with logic. He felt lighter afterward. The fear of loss had disappeared, replaced by certainty. He knew exactly where every dollar was, every signature stood, every right belonged. He didn't need trust anymore. He had proof. And proof, unlike love, doesn't change its mind. As he closed the last folder, he whispered a thought to himself. Not a prayer, not a curse, but a promise that the next chapter would be his. The law would speak where his voice could not, and his silence would be the loudest sound his son would ever hear. The next phase began without noise, without anger, and without warning. The father had spent enough time preparing. Now came the execution, quiet, precise, legal, and final. Every step he took from that moment on was deliberate. He didn't announce his plans, didn't share his intentions. Silence became his ally, and patience became his weapon. When someone wounds you deeply, the greatest revenge is to heal in front of them while they remain unaware of what's coming. He began with the bank. Early one morning, while the world was still half asleep, he dressed neatly, gathered his folders, and went out. The air was cold, but refreshing. He walked to the branch he had visited for decades, the same one where he had opened his first account as a young man. The staff there knew him as quiet, polite, and predictable. But that day, his calm carried authority. He walked in not as a customer, but as a man reclaiming control of his story. He requested a private meeting with the branch manager. The woman led him to a glass-walled office, and he laid his folders on the desk. Every statement, every proof, every authorization form sat neatly in order. He explained calmly and clearly about the unauthorized transactions, the ongoing misuse, and his decision to separate finances permanently. The manager listened closely, nodding, and said softly, "We'll handle everything confidentially." He simply replied, "I trust paperwork more than people now." Within hours, his instructions were carried out. Joint access was revoked. Secondary authorizations were removed. New passwords, verification questions, and security codes were added. Every link his son once used to access money was severed like a quiet surgical cut. He moved some accounts to a different bank entirely, spreading assets across places where no one knew his family. He set up automatic transfers to private savings plans and issued standing orders that could only be canceled by him in person. He also created a secure trust, not for inheritance, but for protection. The trust had strict terms. No one could access its contents without written consent, not even in emergencies. It wasn't about greed. It was about safety. After the banks came the properties. He met with his lawyer again to finalize ownership transfers. The house his son lived in was technically registered under the father's name. Years ago, he had meant to give it as a gift, but had never completed the paperwork. Now, that decision became his salvation. Through legal documentation, he transferred the property temporarily to a holding company managed by his lawyer's firm. It was a move of pure calculation, invisible to outsiders, but undeniable in law. On paper, it looked like standard restructuring. In truth, it was a quiet extraction. The son would wake up soon to find out that what he called his home no longer belonged to him. The father didn't stop there. He reviewed utility accounts, insurance policies, and business registrations. Every line that had his son's name beside his was revised. He called in favors from old colleagues who now held positions of authority. People who respected him not for wealth, but for integrity. They helped him update records faster, cleaner, and without questions. Each signature felt like a small breath of relief. He wasn't punishing his son out of spite. He was protecting what decades of work had built. There's a kind of strength that doesn't roar. It simply stands tall and refuses to fall again. At home, the son noticed small changes, fewer statements in the mail, a sense that something was shifting, but didn't think much of it. Arrogance always blinds the comfortable. He assumed his father would forget the incident soon, just as he always did. But this time, the silence meant something very different. It meant the storm had already passed, and the damage was already done. While the son laughed at his own cleverness, the father spent his evenings ensuring nothing could ever be reversed. He met notaries, confirmed seals, checked witnesses, and backed up every signed page in secure files. He wasn't rushing. He was patient, moving like a man who knew the importance of permanence. He also began withdrawing sentimental items, family heirlooms, photographs, personal artifacts, the kind of things money could never replace. He packed them quietly, one box at a time, and moved them to a small storage facility in another city. He knew that revenge wasn't complete if you left your memories in the hands of the cruel. There were moments of exhaustion, moments when age caught up with him. His hands trembled slightly as he signed the last few documents, but his heart was steady. He wasn't driven by hate. He was driven by a lifetime of lessons. The same discipline that built his family would now protect it from destruction. He took special care to make sure everything was lawful. He didn't want anyone to say later that he had acted unfairly. He followed every rule, every requirement. His lawyer admired him, saying, "Most people come to me crying. You come prepared." The old man smiled faintly and replied, "Crying doesn't change what's written on paper." One of the hardest moments was visiting the property registrar's office, the place that held records of every home and land he had ever owned. He looked at the entries and saw his name beside them. It reminded him of the years of work, the decades of sweat that had built his small empire. And now, in a single morning, he was moving them like chess pieces. Strategy, not emotion, guided him. The same mind that once built everything from scratch was now unbuilding it with grace. Every night, when he returned home, he felt the weight of secrecy, but not guilt. He reminded himself that this wasn't about destroying his son. It was about reminding him of the value of humility. Sometimes, the only way to teach gratitude is to take away what was never appreciated. He also made sure that his will reflected his new reality. The old version had left equal shares to his son. The new one did not. Instead, it detailed strict conditions for access, respect, care, and proof of moral conduct. If those weren't met, everything would go to charity. He didn't hate his son. He simply refused to reward cruelty. In the following days, the father began liquidating small investments, bonds, certificates, and long-term funds. He converted part of them into assets under his trust, while donating another portion to charitable causes anonymously. It wasn't just about reclaiming control. It was about releasing himself from emotional debt. The more he simplified, the freer he felt. He realized something profound in those days of quiet action. When people betray you, they take your peace first, not your money. But when you take your power back, peace returns before anything else. He felt that peace now. It wasn't loud or triumphant. It was still and deep. The kind of peace that comes from knowing the storm has ended and the sky will never look the same again, but it's clearer now. At home, he noticed his son becoming restless. He made more phone calls, spent more time checking emails and statements. He could sense something was happening, but didn't yet know what. The father stayed silent, calm, even kind. He still cooked dinner, still asked polite questions, still smiled faintly. But beneath that smile was a fortress built on legal precision and unshakable calm. He didn't need to expose or humiliate his son in front of anyone. He didn't need to seek revenge through noise. He believed in a deeper form of justice, one that arrives in envelopes, not arguments. One morning, as he sealed the final letter for his lawyer, he said softly to himself, It's done. Everything was ready. The bank accounts were separate. The ownerships were shifted. The trust was active. The house, the land, the wealth, all secure. His son still didn't know, and that was the beauty of it. Revenge doesn't always arrive as thunder. Sometimes it moves quietly like fog, unseen but everywhere. And when it finally clears, the world looks different for the one who caused the pain. The father slept peacefully that night for the first time in months. The weight of fear was gone. The silence in his house no longer felt like loneliness. It felt like victory. The man who was once betrayed was now untouchable. And when morning came, the light fell through the window softly, like a quiet reminder that justice doesn't need applause. It only needs patience, precision, and the courage to act when the heart says, enough. When truth is ready, it does not announce itself. It simply arrives. The father had gathered, signed, sealed, and prepared. Every form was in order. Every clause was reviewed twice. Every signature was placed with a steady hand. The storm he had been building in silence was now complete, and it was time for the world, especially one person, to feel its quiet power. He began with the institutions. His lawyer filed a series of formal notifications to banks, companies, and property registries. Each document cited ownership, authorization, and verification. These weren't angry letters or emotional statements. They were instruments of law, structured, unemotional, and final. The first step was the banking chain. Within a few days, transactions began freezing one by one. Every account tied to his name, every business connection that relied on shared ownership, all redirected, all reviewed, all locked. The son was still unaware. He was too busy enjoying the false peace of comfort built on theft. He believed the silence meant forgiveness, that his father's old age had turned into forgetfulness. But the truth is, forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. Forgiveness lets you rest at night. Forgetting lets the guilty repeat. The father had chosen peace, not blindness. As the first notices arrived at financial offices, the staff followed standard procedure: verification, approval, and enforcement. Within 48 hours, the son's access began to fade. Logins failed, transfers declined, cards deactivated. He thought it was a glitch. He called the bank. They told him politely to visit the branch for clarification. He didn't know that the same branch was where his father had already placed the final seal. Meanwhile, the lawyer coordinated with real estate offices. The father's assets, properties, stocks, mutual holdings, were secured under the new trust he had created. This trust was irreversible. The terms were specific. No beneficiary could alter or claim ownership without the trustee's approval. And the trustee was a longtime confidant, loyal, discreet, professional. Every house, every title, every land record that once stood under family holdings now had a new signature, the father's, only his. The most significant move came last. The primary residence, the house his son called his own, was listed quietly for sale. The transaction was done through a private buyer, arranged by the lawyer under confidentiality. Within days, an agreement was reached, the deal closed, and payment transferred into the father's private account, one his son didn't even know existed. The home would soon have new owners. And the man who had once claimed it through arrogance would learn what it feels like to stand outside his own gate. While these changes unfolded, the father remained composed. He still greeted his son each morning with a calm nod. He still asked about his day. He even offered tea once or twice. Nothing in his behavior hinted at the earthquake that had already begun beneath their feet. There is a unique kind of power in pretending not to notice someone's downfall, especially when that downfall is of their own making. As the legal processes continued, word began spreading in quiet corners, not as gossip, but as realization. Associates who once saw the son as an heir began receiving revised documents. Contracts that had once listed him as a partner now excluded him completely. His phone calls to business partners started going unanswered. Emails came back with automated replies. Ownership structure changed. Please direct communication to the primary trustee. Each reply was a reminder of what he had lost, not through theft, not through argument, but through law. The father met his lawyer one final time to close the file. They reviewed the last set of transfers, the receipts, and the signed notices. It was complete. Nothing was left exposed. Every possible loophole was sealed. The son could fight, but he would lose, not because of influence or power, but because of paperwork that could not be undone. Law, once written, is cold and final, and that coldness now stood as the father's greatest ally. In those meetings, the lawyer often looked at him with quiet admiration. "You've handled this with more dignity than most," he said. The father smiled gently, his eyes calm but deep. "Dignity is the last thing they can't steal," he replied. It wasn't arrogance, it was truth. A week later, the storm surfaced. The son woke up to a message from his bank. "Your access has been restricted pending verification." Another email followed about property ownership disputes. Then came the lawyer's notice informing him of title changes. He called his father in panic, shouting questions. The old man didn't react. He simply handed him an envelope. Inside were copies of the documents, official seals, signatures, and clauses that confirmed the new reality. For the first time, the son understood that silence doesn't mean weakness. It means timing. He ran to his lawyer, hoping to undo it. But the lawyer explained patiently that every step was legally binding. The father had followed every rule, obtained every approval, and executed everything through the right channels. There was nothing to challenge. Every asset, every dollar, every signature was now out of his reach. He had spent years believing that youth meant power. Now he stood powerless before the strength of wisdom. The father didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He didn't even smile. He just packed a small suitcase with clothes, a few photos, and the same pen he had used to sign every document. He looked around his house one last time, not as a man leaving, but as a man finishing a chapter. Everything that mattered was safe. Everything that hurt him was gone. When he closed the door, he didn't lock it. He didn't need to. The law had already locked everything worth keeping. Outside, the air was cool. He walked slowly down the familiar street, his heart light for the first time in years. Behind him stood a house that no longer belonged to his bloodline, a monument to greed turned into a lesson of consequence. The son, meanwhile, sat among papers, letters, and confusion. He called friends for help, but none answered. Money, he was learning, doesn't buy loyalty. It only rents it. And when the payments stop, so does the friendship. He stared at the documents over and over, trying to find a loophole. There was none. The father had written every line with the precision of a man who had spent his life building and protecting. The same precision now dismantled everything his son thought was his. Days turned into silence. The house went on sale officially, and the son had no legal claim. Bank accounts reflected zero balances under his name. His reputation in the community faltered. Those who once admired him whispered instead. They spoke not of the father's revenge, but of the son's arrogance. The truth always travels quietly, but it always arrives. The father moved to a small rented home outside the city. He didn't need luxury. He needed peace. Each morning, he would sit by the window with his tea, watching the sun rise over quiet streets. He felt no hatred, no regret, no pride, only relief. He had done what needed to be done. His hands were clean. Sometimes he wondered if his son had learned, whether the loss had humbled him or hardened him further. But he didn't seek the answer. Some lessons don't need to be checked. They just need to be taught. One evening, the lawyer called to confirm that the final settlement from the house sale had cleared. The funds were now under the father's trust. The total value, almost $3 million. It wasn't just money. It was a lifetime. Decades of work, decades of faith, decades of patience, all restored, all protected, all his. He thanked the lawyer quietly and ended the call. Then he closed his eyes and smiled for the first time in a long while. The world had taken much from him: youth, strength, and family peace, but not his ability to stand again. In that silence, he understood something profound. Revenge fades, but justice remains. And the purest justice is the kind that never needs to shout. There comes a moment when silence breaks, not with sound, but with realization. The son had been living in comfort, unaware that the foundation beneath his life had already crumbled. It happened slowly at first, like cracks forming beneath a painted wall. He noticed small inconveniences, a card declined at a restaurant, an email from the bank requesting verification, a lawyer's notice marked urgent. But he brushed them off, thinking it was all temporary, a glitch to be fixed with a call. He didn't yet know that every system he relied on had already been rewritten. Days passed before the full storm arrived. It began on a Friday morning when the world felt normal. He poured his coffee, opened his laptop, and logged into his banking portal. The screen flashed a message he had never seen before. Access restricted. Please contact your account manager. He frowned, tried again, entered his credentials twice more, the same result. Confused, he called the helpline. The polite voice on the other end informed him that changes had been made under lawful authorization. When he demanded details, the representative replied, "Sir, you are no longer listed as a primary holder." His heart skipped. The words didn't make sense. It was his money, his home, his name. But as he hung up, panic began to sink in. He opened his drawers, searching for paperwork, for statements, for anything that would explain. What he found instead were letters, official, sealed, and neatly stacked. One by one, he tore them open. Each was colder than the last. One from the bank, one from the property registrar, one from the lawyer's office, and one from the new trustee, a man he had never met. Each letter told the same story: the transfer of ownership, the restructuring of assets, the reallocation of funds. Every account he had once claimed was gone. Every title he had once boasted about now belonged elsewhere. And at the center of every document was the same signature, his father's. The man he had underestimated, the man he had mocked, the man whose silence he had mistaken for surrender. He rushed through the house, calling his lawyer, calling his bank, even calling his father. But there was no answer. The walls echoed only his own voice. The silence around him grew heavier, thicker. It was as if the house itself had turned against him, no longer recognizing him as its owner. Hours later, his lawyer returned the call, speaking cautiously. "Your father acted within full legal rights," he said. "Every document was properly notarized and signed in the presence of witnesses. There's no reversal possible. The transfers are valid." The son's voice cracked. "But it's my property," he insisted. The lawyer paused, then said quietly, "Not anymore." He sat down on the cold marble floor, surrounded by papers, the same papers he had once ignored when his father tried to teach him responsibility. Each page now carried the weight of his arrogance. Every signature was a scar carved by his own greed. As the evening settled in, he heard a knock at the door. When he opened it, he found a man in a formal suit holding a file. The man introduced himself as the representative of the new owners. The house had been sold, the contracts finalized, and he was there to inform him of the upcoming handover date. The son stood frozen, the reality sinking in like winter rain. The same house where he had shouted, laughed, and treated his father with disdain was no longer his shelter. It was now just a property he had to vacate. He tried to call his father again, desperate for explanation, desperate for mercy. This time, the call went through. The old man's voice was steady, calm, distant. "I heard you," he said softly. "You took what was mine without asking. I've taken back what was ours without anger." Then the line went dead. That one sentence carried the weight of years. It wasn't rage, it wasn't revenge, it was balance, restored through silence. The next few days became a blur. The son drove from bank to bank, pleading for help. Every institution gave him the same answer. The accounts were now frozen or redirected under verified authority. He couldn't access a cent. The cards didn't work. Even his investments had been redirected. It was as if the entire world had quietly erased him from its system. Meanwhile, the father's name appeared in quiet corners, not in gossip, but in respect. The same people who had once whispered about the old man being outdated now spoke about his brilliance. The way he had moved with such precision, without chaos, without confrontation. The man who had once been humiliated by betrayal was now being remembered for his mastery of patience. The son's arrogance began to collapse under the weight of his consequences. He stopped sleeping, stopped smiling, stopped believing that age meant weakness. He began to see his father differently, not as a frail man, but as a strategist who had waited in silence until the right moment arrived. Then came the final notice, a courier letter from the law firm. Inside it was a certified document outlining the full execution of property and financial transfer. Attached was a short note in his father's handwriting. For years, I built everything for you. For 1 week, you destroyed it. Now, I've rebuilt it, but this time, without you. That was the moment it broke him. The pride that had fueled his cruelty shattered into pieces. He realized that his father's revenge was not about destruction. It was about revelation. He hadn't taken his son's wealth. He had taken away the illusion that he could mistreat someone and still remain untouchable. He drove to his father's old home, hoping to find him. But when he arrived, the gate was locked and a sold sign stood planted in the ground. The house looked smaller now, emptier, almost unrecognizable. He asked a neighbor where the old man had gone, but no one knew. They only said, he left quietly, didn't tell anyone. That night, he sat in his car for hours, staring at the dark house. Every window he looked at reflected his own guilt. The same house where his father once waited for him with dinner was now gone. The same man he had betrayed had vanished into peace. Meanwhile, far away, the father sat by a quiet lakeside, a cup of tea beside him, watching the water reflect the evening sky. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply breathed in the silence that used to feel heavy and now felt pure. His lawyer had confirmed that everything was complete. His assets were secure, his dignity restored. The world had balanced itself again, and he hadn't needed a single word to make it happen. He thought of his son, not with hatred, but with clarity. Love doesn't vanish overnight, but it changes shape. What once was affection had become distance. What once was trust had become memory. He wished no harm, only understanding. He hoped his son would learn what value really meant, not in currency, but in character. The next morning, the son received one last message from an unknown number. It read, "The world gives back what you give to it. I gave you everything. You gave me betrayal. Now we're even." There was no name at the end, but he knew who it was from. He read it again and again, each time feeling a different kind of silence settle in. From that day on, he lived smaller, quieter, and lonelier. He worked harder, not for success, but for redemption. He never spoke publicly about what had happened. He didn't need to. Everyone already knew, not because the old man had told them, but because truth always finds its way out. And in that truth lay the real revelation, not that the father had taken his money or his home, but that he had taken away his ability to harm others again. The father, now far away, found peace in simplicity. Each sunrise was his reward, each calm night his victory. He didn't check accounts or dwell on the past. He had rewritten the ending of his story the way it deserved to be told, not as a victim, but as a man who reclaimed his dignity through silence and wisdom. Morning light carried a different kind of silence. It wasn't the hush of peace or comfort. It was the quiet after truth has spoken, when nothing more can be said. The sun woke in a house that no longer felt like his own. The walls, once warm with laughter and noise, now echoed only guilt and emptiness. The furniture seemed foreign, the air heavy. Every sound, the ticking clock, the creak of the chair, the distant hum of the fridge, felt like a reminder of what he had lost. He wandered through rooms aimlessly, touching things that had once been symbols of pride, framed certificates, gifts from old friends, a family photo of him and his father smiling side by side. Now, each object looked like evidence, proof of how arrogance blinds love. The old man in the photo was gone, but his presence filled every inch of the house. The son felt smaller than ever before. Neighbors who once waved now avoided eye contact. They whispered softly when he passed by, not out of cruelty, but out of pity. Everyone had heard what happened, not from gossip, but from the slow, quiet rhythm of truth. Some called it karma, some called it justice, but all agreed that the father had done what few could: protect his dignity without a single act of rage. The son spent days calling his brothers, cousins, and anyone who might help, but no one wanted to get involved. Some said, "You should have treated him better." Others just sighed and hung up. The silence of rejection hit harder than any word. He realized that money could buy comfort, but it could never buy character, and now he had neither. He tried to meet his father again, to apologize, to plead, to explain, but the old man was gone, vanished like a shadow at sunrise. The lawyer refused to reveal his location. The trustee spoke only through formal notices. It was as if the world itself had turned its back on him, leaving him to sit in the ruins of his own decisions. Meanwhile, far away, the father watched the days unfold with a calm that only wisdom brings. He didn't celebrate. He didn't hate. He simply let time do what it does best: separate truth from noise. The revenge was never about money. It was about restoration, restoring his peace, his self-worth, and his sense of control over a life that had been taken for granted. He lived modestly, in a small town where no one knew his past. He walked every morning through narrow streets lined with trees. The sun touched his face gently, as if apologizing for all the harshness he had endured. He ate simple meals, cooked his own food, and spoke little. Each day, he wrote one sentence in his diary, not about loss, but about gratitude. Gratitude for the quiet, for the lessons, for the strength that patience had given him. One day, a letter arrived from his lawyer. Inside was a short update. The sale of all previous properties has been finalized. Remaining funds have been deposited into the trust. Current balance, $3.1 million. He folded the letter carefully, set it on the table, and looked out the window. The number didn't matter. The peace did. He had no desire to use the money for grand things. It was a reminder, not a trophy, a symbol of how easily power changes hands when respect disappears. Back in the city, the son's life grew smaller. He sold his car, moved into a small apartment, and started working odd jobs. He told himself he was rebuilding, but deep down, he knew he was paying the price. Every paycheck he earned reminded him of his father's hands, those wrinkled, calloused hands that had worked harder than he ever would. For years, he had mocked them. Now, he envied them. He began keeping to himself, visiting places where no one recognized him. Sometimes he'd sit near the park his father once loved, hoping to feel something familiar. He never saw him, but sometimes the wind carried a faint sense of his presence, a calmness he could never regain. He started volunteering at shelters, helping old men who had no one to talk to. Maybe, in some small way, he thought he could earn back what he had lost. The father never reached out, but he kept track quietly through the lawyer. When he heard that his son was working again, he felt a quiet satisfaction, not because of struggle, but because humility had finally returned to his son's life. Some lessons, he thought, can't be taught with words. They require emptiness to echo. Years passed. The son grew older, humbler. He no longer spoke about wealth or success. He lived simply, saving what little he could, often sending small donations anonymously to elder homes, never signing his name. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was change. Either way, it was something the old man would have been proud of. One winter morning, long after the dust had settled, a courier arrived at the father's door with a small brown envelope. Inside was a letter written in his son's handwriting, shaky, hesitant, but sincere. It read, "Father, I was blind. You taught me without shouting. You hurt me without hitting. You left me without hating. I finally understand. I hope wherever you are, you eat in peace, sleep without pain, and remember that I finally learned what love really means. I'm sorry for being late to the lesson." The father read it twice, maybe 3 times, and set it beside his teacup. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. But his eyes softened, like the sky just before rain. He whispered to himself, "At last." He never replied. Not because he didn't forgive, but because forgiveness doesn't always need a letter. Sometimes it exists in silence, like a bridge rebuilt from both ends without anyone seeing. The son continued to live quietly, carrying his lessons as scars. The father, on the other hand, lived peacefully until his final days, surrounded by simplicity, not luxury. His last act before passing was a will that no one expected. He left a portion of his estate to his son, not as a reward, but as a reminder that forgiveness is stronger than revenge. The rest went to charities, elder care homes, and hospitals that had once treated him kindly. When the son received the news, he wept, not for the money, but for the man he had lost long before death. He realized that the greatest wealth wasn't in the millions his father had protected. It was in the dignity he had defended and the silence he had mastered. And as years went on, people who knew their story often spoke of the old man with respect. They didn't call him ruthless. They called him wise. They said he taught the world a simple truth, that revenge done with noise fades fast, but justice done in silence lasts forever. In the end, the son never fully recovered from the lesson, but he never repeated his cruelty again, and the father's story became something more than just a tale of betrayal. It became a quiet testament to the strength of calm hearts, to the idea that true victory doesn't shout, it simply is. The world eventually forgot their names, but the story lingered, passed down in whispers between those who had seen greed destroy families and silence rebuild them. And perhaps, somewhere beyond all the noise, the father's soul smiled, not in triumph, but in peace, because his final revenge wasn't taking everything back. It was teaching his son the meaning of loss, love, and redemption. Peace rarely arrives loudly. It comes quietly, like morning sunlight slipping through a half-open curtain. The old man's new life began in this way, not with celebration, but with stillness. After years of noise, betrayal, and confrontation, he wanted nothing but silence. Not the silence of loneliness, but the kind that heals, that gives meaning to everything that came before. He chose a small town near the sea, a place where no one knew his story. The air was soft, carrying the scent of salt and flowers. The roads were narrow, lined with quiet houses and slow smiles. Every face he met greeted him with warmth, not curiosity. It felt like the world had opened its arms again, not to reward him, but to remind him that peace still existed somewhere beyond pain. He rented a small home by the edge of the village. It had 2 rooms, one window facing the ocean, and a garden where wild plants grew freely. The roof creaked at night when the wind passed, but it was a comforting sound, a reminder that life still moved, even in silence. He bought a simple wooden chair and placed it by the window. That became his favorite place, his throne, his confession seat, his temple of quiet thoughts. Every morning, he woke before sunrise. The world outside was still dark, painted in shades of blue and gray. He would sit with a blanket over his shoulders, holding a cup of warm tea. He watched the first light touch the waves, turning them gold for a few moments before the day began. In those minutes, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: belonging. The kind that doesn't come from people or possessions, but from finally being at peace with oneself. His days were slow but full. He tended to his small garden, watering plants and trimming leaves. He cooked his own meals, simple food but made with calm hands. He read old books, the kind that smelled of time and wisdom. Sometimes he would walk to the market, greet the locals, and share a short smile. No one asked about his past, and that was exactly what he needed. For the first time in decades, he was seen not as a father, not as a victim, not as a man with a story, but as a human being simply existing in the world. There was a small bench near the shore where he sat in the evenings. The sea never judged him. It didn't ask what happened or why. It just kept moving, wave after wave, teaching him that even the greatest storms eventually fade into calm. He watched children play nearby, fishermen untangle their nets, and old couples walk hand in hand. Every moment reminded him that life had more to offer than bitterness, if one was willing to let go. At night, he sometimes looked up at the stars and thought about the past, not with anger, but with understanding. He remembered his son, not the cruelty, not the betrayal, but the boy who once held his hand at the fair, the child who once smiled with pride when he came home from work. Time has a strange way of softening even the sharpest memories. The pain that once burned now simply glowed, not as a wound, but as a reminder of what he had overcome. His lawyer still sent him monthly updates. The trust remained strong, investments stable, and his estate growing quietly. The numbers didn't matter to him. He no longer measured life in money. The only wealth that meant anything now was peace. Still, he made a habit of sending small donations every month, to orphanages, to hospitals, to old-age homes. Each payment was a message written in silence. I once lost faith in people, but I found it again in strangers. The villagers soon grew fond of him. They called him Uncle, though some whispered Grandpa with affection. Children often came by to help him with groceries or sit in his garden, listening to his soft stories about patience, time, and forgiveness. He never mentioned names, never spoke of revenge. He told them that life is a long circle, that every hurt finds its own end, and every kindness comes back stronger. One afternoon, he met a small boy who reminded him of his own son when he was young. The boy lived nearby and had lost his father early. The old man took him under his wing, helping him with homework, teaching him simple lessons about life, honesty, humility, and gratitude. He never said it aloud, but in his heart, he was rebuilding the bond he had lost. It wasn't replacement. It was redemption. Years passed in this rhythm. Seasons came and went, and with each passing year, he grew more at peace with the world. The wrinkles on his face deepened, but they looked softer, not tired. His hair turned white completely, his hands slower, but his eyes remained alive, full of stories he no longer needed to tell. Sometimes he would receive letters from distant relatives, some curious, some regretful. He answered politely, but never reopened old wounds. He had learned that closure doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from knowing that you no longer need it. There were nights when loneliness visited, quiet but honest. He didn't fight it. He sat with it, shared his tea with it, and let it stay until it left. Even loneliness, he realized, has its purpose. It teaches you to appreciate peace. On his birthdays, he never celebrated. He simply lit a small candle, not for himself, but for the journey, for surviving pain without turning bitter, for walking through betrayal and still finding beauty in mornings. He didn't want grand gifts or parties. The sound of the ocean was enough. In the village, people began to notice how content he seemed. A man who owned much, yet lived simply. A man who had every reason to be angry, yet smiled gently at strangers. Some whispered about his past, wondering what made him so calm. But those who knew him closely said he must have seen pain and conquered it with silence. His health began to decline gradually, as age always demands its due. But even in weakness, he remained dignified. When doctors suggested treatments, he nodded kindly, but said, "I've lived long enough to know peace is the best medicine." He never complained. Pain, after all, had been his oldest companion, and now even that felt softer. In his final years, the sea became his closest friend. He would walk to the shore every morning and whisper small thanks, to life, to time, to forgiveness. Some days he wrote short notes and left them in bottles, tossing them into the tide. No one knew what they said, but he did. They were small prayers of gratitude for the balance life had restored. One evening, he sat by the window as the sky turned orange. The air was cool, the horizon quiet. He thought about his son one last time, not with pain, not with pride, but with peace. Somewhere, he believed, his son had learned the meaning of love, maybe too late, but learned nonetheless. That was enough for him. He closed his eyes and whispered a small prayer for forgiveness, not for what he did, but for what life had turned them into. Then he smiled, a soft, unburdened smile. It was the smile of a man who had seen the world in its cruelest form and still found beauty left within it. That night, as he drifted to sleep, the sea sang its endless lullaby. The wind brushed gently against his window, and the world, in its own quiet way, said thank you for proving that even after betrayal, there can still be peace, and even after cruelty, there can still be grace. Time has a strange way of healing things. It doesn't erase what happened. It just changes the way it lives inside you. Pain becomes memory. Anger becomes understanding. And betrayal, when faced with patience, becomes wisdom. Now, as I sit here in the quiet of my small home, I often think about the long road behind me, the faces I've loved, the mistakes I've made, the nights I cried quietly so no one would hear. It all feels distant now, not gone, just softer, like a song that once played loudly and now hums faintly in the background. I am not proud of everything I did. I am not proud of every thought I had, but I am proud that I never let cruelty change who I was. That, I think, is what real strength means. Not how loud you fight, but how gently you can stand when life hits you the hardest. When I was younger, I believed that family was something that could never break. I believed love alone was enough to protect you. I believed blood was sacred. I was wrong. Love without respect is just a word. Blood without loyalty is just coincidence. And silence, when it allows cruelty, becomes permission. It took me almost a lifetime to learn that lesson. My son's betrayal used to burn in me like fire. There were nights I couldn't sleep, not because of anger, but because of disbelief. How could someone I raised with my own hands treat me like that? How could he look into my eyes and still lie? But over time, I realized it wasn't about me. It was about the emptiness inside him that I couldn't fill. You can teach a man everything, except gratitude. That has to be learned through loss. People ask me now if I regret what I did, selling the house, draining his account, walking away. I don't, because I didn't do it to destroy him. I did it to wake him. Sometimes the only way to make someone see the truth is to let them fall. Not out of hate, but out of love that refuses to feed blindness any longer. For years I thought revenge would taste sweet, but it doesn't. It tastes quiet. It tastes like still water after a storm, not sweet, not bitter, just still. It doesn't give joy. It gives space to breathe again. And that is enough. The truth is, I forgave him long before he asked. Forgiveness isn't a gift you give the other person. It's something you give yourself. The moment I forgave him, I stopped carrying his cruelty on my back. I stopped living in his shadow. I began living again, not as his father, not as his victim, but as a man who had survived. If I could speak to him now, I wouldn't speak about the past. I wouldn't mention money or houses or betrayal. I would tell him that peace costs more than pride, that respect is worth more than any inheritance, that no matter how rich a man becomes, he is poor if he has no kindness left in him. Sometimes, when I sit by the sea and watch the waves, I wonder what he's doing now. Maybe he's learned. Maybe he's changed. Or maybe he's still chasing what doesn't matter. Either way, I don't wish him pain. I wish him clarity. I wish he learns what I learned, that life will always return the same energy you give it. I used to think silence was weakness. Now I know it's power. The loudest truth is the one you don't shout. The calmest revenge is the one you don't announce. I didn't destroy his life. I let his choices do it for him. And then I walked away with mine intact. Age teaches you strange things. When you're young, you fight to be right. When you're older, you fight to be at peace. When I look back now, I see that every moment of betrayal was also a lesson in strength. Every tear was proof that I still cared. Every silence was the beginning of wisdom. People think growing old means losing things, health, energy, memory. But sometimes growing old means gaining something else entirely. perspective. The kind that lets you look at your scars and smile, not because they're gone, but because they no longer hurt. I've come to understand that revenge is never truly about the other person. It's about taking back the control they tried to steal. It's about saying, "You can't decide my worth. You can't define my ending." That's what I did, and in doing so, I finally became free. My life now is simple, and that's what makes it rich. I wake up with no noise in my head, no bitterness in my chest. I make my tea, I watch the sunrise, and I thank life for one more day. I talk to people who see me as I am, not as what I was. I find beauty in ordinary things: a bird landing on my window, a child laughing in the distance, the soft rustle of wind through the trees. These are the small riches that betrayal can't take away. I sometimes write in a small notebook, not about the past, but about gratitude. I write the things I am thankful for: clean air, good health, forgiveness. It's strange, but even after everything, I find myself writing his name sometimes, not with anger, but with peace. Because no matter what happened, he taught me one last lesson: that love doesn't end when it breaks. It just changes shape. And that's the truth I want people to know: that when someone betrays you, they don't define you. You do. You can stay in pain forever, or you can turn that pain into wisdom. You can curse the darkness, or you can light a small candle and sit quietly with it. I chose the candle. My story is not about revenge. It's about restoration, of respect, of balance, of peace. It's about learning that sometimes, to heal, you must let go of even the ones you love. And that doesn't make you cold. It makes you whole. If anyone hears my story and sees themselves in it, I hope they learn what I learned: that silence can be your greatest ally, and dignity your greatest revenge. Speak less, act wisely, and let time do what anger never can. Now, when I close my eyes, I see not the moments he hurt me, but the moments I rose above it. I see the day I walked away, not as a day of loss, but of freedom. I see the sea, endless and patient, teaching me that nothing stays broken forever, not waves, not hearts, not people. I have no hatred left, only calm. The kind of calm that comes when you've looked pain in the eye and said, "You can stay if you want, but you won't control me anymore." That's when peace finally sits beside you, like an old friend who was always there, just waiting for you to stop fighting. And maybe that's what life really is: learning to stop fighting what has already happened and start accepting what still can. So this is my reflection, not a confession of sorrow, but a declaration of survival. I was betrayed. I was humiliated, but I was never defeated. I didn't shout. I didn't curse. I simply stood up, cleaned the dust off my hands, and built a quieter life. If there's one message I would leave behind, it's this: respect is the last currency worth keeping. Money fades, houses crumble, but the way you treat people, especially the ones who built your life, that echoes long after you're gone. He stole my credit card thinking I was weak. I drained his account not to prove I was strong, but to show that even in silence, justice can still speak. And in the end, that's what this story is about. Not revenge, not punishment, but truth. The truth that love without respect becomes poison. That patience, when tested, can become power. And that sometimes, the kindest thing you can do for someone who has hurt you is to let them see who you become without them.